Support local restaurants. We've been to every city, including Little Rock.
And even
Worcester.
And
Alrighty, everybody. Welcome to the breakdown with WB or the breakdown with Birkenhoff. Hopefully, everybody's having a good day so far, or a good night, depending on wherever your time zone you're in, or whatever you want to call that. Today's going to be a good stream. I'll just give a quick announcement. I'll probably say it throughout this whole episode. Throughout this whole episode of 1 second, got distracted. Okay, I'm probably going to be saying this announcement multiple times throughout all of what we're going to watch here and discuss for today's episode. But I'm going to be moving the podcast to tomorrow just because I want to get a little bit more news stories and hopefully an update based off of the last mass shooting. There's been a couple now in this week, so it's a rather heavy news week in coverage and just a very bad news week. And so I'm just going to wait one more day, see if I can get any more information based off of that last shooting and update on any other stories and just make sure I'm kind of all caught up for this kind of busy news week. So I'm going to be moving the podcast to Thursday, probably Thursday afternoon. But I'm still going to be having my Getting the Answer show with Anna Voltes tomorrow at 10 Central Time or 11 a.m. Eastern Time in the morning, where we are going to be discussing how to fix the educational system in the United States. So yes, this would be the third episode, or the third live stream based off of that topic. But I think we are, it's an important topic, and I'm interested to hear his opinion on the topic as well. So that's kind of what we're going to be doing for Thursday, but I thought I would give an announcement right away, and I'll probably be giving it a couple more times throughout the episode. So yesterday we had some problems playing the video I wanted to play, and I started a little bit later than I wanted to. And today we're a little bit, we're starting more closer to the times where I want to start for the stream. But anyway, long story short, we were having problems playing the video, and we were having issues with time. So I thought I would just go ahead and start with that first video we were going to watch on the last live stream. Then we're going to read and end with a video that I wanted to cover for the first episode. And then we're going to get into kind of the stuff I wanted to cover for part 2 of this particular time frame I had in my mind of what we need to be covering for all of the topics here for how to fix the educational system. So we're just going to dive right into this first video of information about the U.S. education system, as well as some ideas to possibly fix the system we have now. So I'm going to go ahead and pause our calming music, and we'll get into our first video after this ad. And we'll be reshaping this here live on stream as we go through all of our topics here and change format so that we can be able to see everything a little bit better, because that is very important. But I thought eventually I'll get to where I have overlays for all of these topics, or scenes. I guess it's not really overlays, but more scenes for the topic, so we'll make things a lot more easier to follow, because the flow is going to be a lot better doing it that way. So let's see if we can't reshape our video to fit the screen a little bit better. Move this down here. Alrighty, we'll try it this way. This way we can at least see the video and it doesn't look too terrible. So I'm going to go back a little bit so that we can catch the beginning of what she was going to say, and then we can dive in to the real important information. And for those who are going to catch me now or catch me later throughout the episode, you can definitely let me know about volume and make sure that everything is you can hear everything. Anyway, let's get started.
Talk about the U.S. education system, but before I do, I've got a few disclaimers I need to put out there. First of all, I want to recognize how absolutely privileged I am to have an education at all. There's countries in the world today that don't have schools, and there's thousands of children struggling to survive in poverty that don't know where their next meal is coming from, let alone what their school is teaching. I'm not trying to say that advanced math, science, and history should not be taught, just that there's other subjects that personally might be a little bit more important considering today's global economy. There's more that I'm going to touch on rather than just what's taught, even though I can't possibly cover everything in detail, but I just wanted to explain that and get that out of the way now. Some of this is going to be opinion, but I'm going to do my best just to present the facts to you with as little bias as possible, as always. So with that being said, let's dive right in and get a clearer picture of what the United States education system is like and how it got so broken. Let's get into it. In recent years, we've seen more articles, more videos, and more discussion about what's being taught in school. YouTube videos like Don't Stay in School have gone viral, stating how ridiculous it is that we know the mitochondria is the powerhouse of the cell, but we're clueless when it comes to taxes. how we know the different classifications of rocks but basic first aid isn't mandatory. So many people can relate to this, and it sparks some worthy discussion about the education system. But before we get into reform and what's broken, let's see who built the education system to be this way in the first place. It turns out a man named Horace Mann is credited with creating the public education system. He was born in 1796 and in 1838 founded the Common School Journal. His 6 main principles were the following. The public should no longer remain ignorant. That such education should be paid for, controlled, and sustained by an interested public. That this education will be best provided in schools that embrace children from a variety of backgrounds. That this education must be non-sectarian, not affiliated with religious groups. That this education must be taught using the tenets of a free society, and that education should be provided by a well-trained professional teacher. And I can't say I really disagree with those principles. Horace was the father of the common school, a smart man, and he recognized the need for public education, and that's kind of incredible. So I don't want anyone walking away from this video blaming him or something. In the early 1800s, the problems and the education system were so incredibly different, and the needs were not the same as where we're at now in society. It's not as if they did taxes the same way we did today, or, didn't even have them way back when. The first aid wasn't what it is. The stock market, the process of purchasing a home, hell, the 30 basic human rights that the United Nations founded in 1948 didn't exist. So it's not as if a course on taxes, basic first aid, knowing your rights, and all that good stuff was going to be at the front of this man's mind. But then, what was it that Horace had in mind exactly? Well, jobs. More specifically, factory jobs. As William Tressiter at Mission.org wrote, the modern American school system was primarily designed to instill discipline, not to foster learning. Education was more about forming behavioral traits to enforce mental habits, not vice versa. Let that settle in for a moment. Education isn't really about learning. More specifically, it isn't about learning how to learn. It's about learning how to conform. Predictability is the ultimate goal. The logic went something like this. If you could compete, you would be hired for a job. If you were hired, your virtuous habits would eventually lead to your promotion. As promotions accumulate, your pay increases, and eventually you reach financial comfort, or perhaps even significant wealth. Man wanted every man, and not sure about women, to be able to compete in the economy. The fragmented social options weren't able to keep up with the shift in useful skills. A more coordinated effort was required. If nothing happened, the United States would be rocked by social unrest as the classes drifted apart into haves and have-nots. To put it briefly, the education system is about habits, about everyone on equal footing back in the 19th century. It was about getting everyone to do their homework, accepting what they were assigned, completing projects, and caring about scores and ranks, sitting still, those lessons. During that era, it was necessary. It's worth reminding ourselves now about the key characteristics of the industrial era and how we can see them manifested in the education system that continues to operate across America to this day. Schools focus on respecting authority, punctuality, measurement, basic literacy, arithmetic. Notice how these reinforce each other. You enter the system one way and are crammed through an extended molding process. The result? A good enough cog to jam into an industrial machine. Dependable, interchangeable, replaceable. I won't pretend to understand the world of Horace Mann. I've never lived in it. This structure was better than nothing. It gave people an opportunity to work and basic knowledge. But why the fuck haven't we adapted now? Northwestern University economist says the early industrial capitalists spent a great deal of effort and time in the social conditioning of their labor force, especially in Sunday schools, which were designed to inculcate middle-class values and attitudes so as to make the workers more susceptible to the incentives that the factory needed. In a post-industrial world, education may require an equally bold rethink. It might mean more comprehensive adult education or regular retraining to keep skills sharp as old jobs disappear and new ones appear that require vastly different responsibilities. Or it may involve integrating technology to create more personalized learning experiences. We have jobs today that never existed back then, that citizens in the early 1900s could have never dreamed of. Just as how I'm sure that in 100 years from now we'll have new jobs that I would have never dreamed of either. And we need to adapt with it. It's not that traditional subjects are dead. There's still students that go on to study science or English or math. But encompassing everything, every opportunity, and trying to set everyone on the same playing field again, it hardly sounds possible. When the job market was primarily factory worker, the education system instilled the qualities it valued in its future workers. But now, it's not just factory worker as a primary opportunity. There's jobs in video game design, ski, and...
Hello there, Tarot HA. I'm watching this because we're talking about some, how to fix the U.S. education system more than any other education, really, because, well, I know more about it, and I live in the United States. Believe it or not, I actually don't really play too many games, and yet I'm streaming on Twitch, and I watch Twitch quite a bit, so I think that's kind of funny that I think that's funny. The fact that I'm on Twitch and really don't play too many games or even have a PC to do games. I do have an Xbox 360, though. Ooh, fancy, I know. Xbox 360. Ooh.
Instruction, decorating cakes, airplane engineers, YouTubers for God's sake, and countless more. The idea of teaching enough classes for every job is just about impossible, and I get that. A kid that wants to study math today is going to be introduced to it far sooner than a video game designer who would want to start learning the basics of their field, unless they were doing that in their free time. And hiring teachers in hundreds or thousands of completely separate subjects to teach, it's just not happening with how little teachers are already paid. When education reform is addressed by the government, it's still focused on test scores. No Child Left Behind, a law that held schools accountable for how children...
I know Ed, ooh, that was a voice crack there. I know Ed, or Jay Edgar, on YouTube, and he has a Twitch channel too. I'm trying to think of his Twitch name right now. It's like J. Ed Ward or something. I can't remember the exact name now. But he's a part of the Freedom Scoop network that I'm a part of as well. And he loves Fallout New Vegas. And he was playing it not too long ago. I think he actually completed the game because he streamed it like once a week, where he played it for like 3 hours or so for probably a couple of years. Maybe not a couple of years, but for a pretty long time. And I know that he really enjoyed the game.
Learn was one of the more modern examples of an education reform that we've seen. But in my eyes, the problem isn't if the children know all their mathematical equations or Shakespeare plays. It's what the schools are teaching them in the first place. Although the Every Student Succeeds Act, which replaced...
Actually, the No Child Left Behind Act is a little bit controversial, and it's weird to say that it's a little bit controversial because the whole premise or the idea of the No Child Left Behind Act seems very educated, very smart. Like, you don't want to have someone who's uneducated if you have the opportunity to educate them. That's at least what it should be for the United States. Now, if you talk about in the past and America's history with, the civil rights movements and all that, there was obviously times where whites didn't want to give blacks education or Asians education or any other, minority class. But if you're talking about now and the standards that the United States has now, and when this law got implemented, it was the idea that everybody should have an equal opportunity of education, and that's kind of the whole idea. And obviously that sounds really brilliant. It sounds like a great idea. Nobody would not be unhappy with it. The problem has been on how the No Child Left Behind Act has been used. I don't know if she's necessarily going to get into it too much, but there's a weird amount of controversy around something that seems so simple of a concept.
No Child Left Behind in 2015 by Barack Obama tried to correct problems that arose. It felt like no one wants to take on the task of tearing down what we've got and starting over. Hell, I get why. It sounds like hell just thinking about it, but what we have now is incredibly obsolete and it's not helping anybody. As the Foundation for Economic Education says, even though the curriculum of the public education system has developed, the essence has stayed the same. Children are still taught in a standardized and industrialized way. As with anything that comes from a centralized control, it is highly inefficient, bureaucratic, and wasteful. Children rarely are allowed to be children. Play is stifled. Children are crammed into a classroom and taught in a standardized way. Creativity is restricted. They aren't allowed to harness their inquisitive minds. questioning things that is part of the analytic mind and a key to societal.
So this gets into the whole discussion we briefly had on part 1, or yesterday's video, where we were going over, or yesterday's stream really, but where we were going over educational statistics in general, comparing states to other states, comparing a little bit to the United States overall system to better educational systems such as Korea and Finland. And we're going to be looking at Korea and Finland's educational programs and why they're considered so good on today's stream. We didn't really look at that yesterday. We more just kind of briefly talked about it. But one of the major points that we were talking about on that first stream was this very paragraph, really, in essence, because the whole conversation was, should mass schooling, or public education, be something where we try to standardize it, or should it be something where we try to individualize the education? So in other words, and I used this analogy, I don't know if it's really necessarily an analogy, but it works in the same way, kind of. But not everybody is going to be an engineer, not everybody's going to be a doctor, not everybody's going to be a farmer, blah, blah, blah. Everybody has different interests and everybody pursues different things. But the way the United States education works now is we work on these fundamental things such as math and science and reading and English, which aren't necessarily a bad thing, but we try to fit everybody into the same sort of interest into the same sort of field. And it's just something that not everybody's going to want to do. There's a lot of people who don't even want to go to college or would rather go to a trade school and not pursue a higher education through a university or through a college or whatever you want to call it. So the whole idea about trying to make education more personalized is a major debate for having to fix the United States education. But when you're talking about having to teach a mass amount of students and the statistics we looked at on yesterday's episode, where there's increasing class sizes of children who are aged for the school or aged for the classroom. In other words, the more people have kids and have students, okay, let's put it this way. The more people have kids who are in the schooling systems all the way from university and down, the more that rate increases, the more trying to make something personalized and trying to make something selective and trying to make something that's going to work for everybody a lot harder to do. So that is in a large part as to why the United States public education is shaped the way it is.
Development, but this takes a backseat to examinations. The very nature of tests relies on memorization, repetition, and regurgitation. Tests infrequently harness the analytical mind. They train students to know answers. However, they don't train them on how to find the answers. Each child is unique in their own right. Each has a different personality and preferred way of learning. Under the current system, each child is bundled under one standardized umbrella. When considering the different types of learners, it is easy to see why some get left behind.
So this whole debate about learning styles is also something I find very interesting, because I'm in for special education myself. That's what I'm at the college for, is to be a teacher for special needs students. Obviously, that's what special education is. But through wanting to be a teacher, I'm having to take classes on teaching, and with special needs, you have to take classes on particular classes. So I'm having to take a class in reading, having to take a class in math, in biology, and in all of these. So I kind of have to know a little bit about each thing, because there's a chance that I'm going to have to teach all the subjects potentially, or most of the subjects, blah, 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 blah. But through taking these classes as a teacher, because it's reading as a teacher, math as a teacher, where you're learning how to teach math, or you're learning how to teach reading for middle school or for junior high, you get it, where we come across the concept of learning styles. And learning styles weren't always implemented into lesson plans for trying to teach students. It kind of goes back to the generic education that most of that when you were in high school or when you were in junior high or whatever, you probably had yourself, where the teacher had to teach 30 of your peers or 25 of your peers or whatever the number was, and they didn't really vary their teaching style or how they performed the lecture from topic to topic. So there's a big emphasis now on trying to have multiple different learning styles and ideas to try to solve or to try to make a program or make a lesson that more students are going to be able to understand and take away comprehension from, take away understanding from. So I find that very interesting because it doesn't appear like learning styles have always been taken into consideration for lesson plans. And I don't know if Turret, you're still here or not, but let me know if you can actually hear the video fine or not. It looks fine on my audio mixer, but it's always a little bit hard to tell.
Not only does this method of teaching paint everyone with the same brush and teach the same basic skills a factory worker would want, but it's stifling creativity. And there's a lot of creative jobs out there. Like, yeah, I'm on YouTube, but what about painters? What about like the artists that help create my sprites, the editors that help me with my videos, songwriters, researchers, writers, fashion designers, animators, videographers, photographers, illustrators, actors, web designers, tattoo artists, and so on and so on. I'm not saying every school and every teacher suppresses this, but that the current system does not encourage this. The focus is your MCAs, SATs, tests, and grades. Meanwhile, one gigantic reason young people say they don't vote is because they aren't even sure how. When I was 18 and I first went to the polls, I was embarrassed, which, I admit, I didn't even know what some of the topics on the ballot were. I felt like I had done my own research, but, when I got there, all my confidence just left, and I was like, I don't know what they're even asking anymore. And I feel like that's something that I should have learned in school, because that's what you're supposed to do in school, is learn, right? You learn about the government and how to survive and be successful in the world. And yet I walked into a voting booth and I didn't know what the hell I was doing entirely. These things alone tell us that the system isn't working. We don't need to know the skills to work a factory job anymore, in case that hasn't come across loud and clear now. What we need are the skills to learn, to expand our interests and function in the new world. One article from Teachers College, Columbia University, sums it up quite nicely, not just as to why this system doesn't work, but why nothing has been done for so long. Take our schools. Their problem has been misdiagnosed. The nation's school system did not suddenly decline. Imagine a golden age of schooling, perhaps in the 1950s. The highest test scores at that period would be inadequate for the present. The current economy and burgeoning new technologies make the prior performances of our students inadequate. High school dropouts, whose numbers were dramatically higher than now, could get jobs working in a factory or assembly line, making a salary sufficient to support a family. Those jobs do not exist anymore. They have been replaced by low-paying, higher-skilled jobs in the service sector. For high school graduates, entering skill levels required for jobs are also higher. The job facing our nation is not to fix broken schools, but to remake our educational system to meet the needs for a new society. Unfortunately, we are distracted by a diverse debate over whether children are less well prepared academically than in the past. We are focused on how much we may have lost rather than how very much more we need to gain if our youngsters are going to succeed in the future. The nation has rightly recognized that education is troubled, particularly in urban and rural areas. Poll after poll shows better schools among the public's highest priorities. Any candidate running for office, from dog catcher to president, must have an educational platform. Unfortunately, politicians too often seek quick fixes, silver bullets, and newsworthy sound bites rather than comprehensive plans. The education system is as outdated as it is broken. If it doesn't work for...
I don't know if I necessarily agree with that or not. I would have to read all of the journal, or at least a little bit more paragraphs, to get kind of their introduction to the topic, I guess you could say, to build my understanding on that a little bit more. But just from what we read there, I can see her points for sure, but I don't know if I necessarily agree with the premise of that particular debate when it comes to fixing education. But I do think that education is outdated and we need to change the system or how we approach education in the United States. So I will give her that point at the very least.
For us, and hinder students from feeling encouraged, creative, and free to explore the world around them. Make no mistake, it's broken. But thankfully, things are slowly starting to change. It's slow-going progress, but hey, as long as it's progress, that's something. That same article from Columbia University also states, alternatives to public education are being introduced around the country. Milwaukee, Cleveland, and Florida have created voucher programs allowing students to attend private, even for-profit schools rather than public
Sorry about that.
Homeschooling, which now enrolls between 500,000 and 2 million children, is permitted in all 50 states. And I understand homeschooling isn't possible for everyone. Plenty of families rely on two incomes, both parents working, or they don't have the resources or qualifications to do that. And it's the same reason a parent can't be expected to teach their child about these financial and technical things. They may not know the subject themselves. But at least, I imagine, as long as homeschooling is done properly, a student's teacher, aka their parent, would be able to help them on a more personal level, center lessons around the way their child learns, and be able to include comprehensive and modern applications. And contrary to the name, homeschooling takes place in an actual home only a fraction of the time. A great deal of instruction happens in community colleges, at libraries, or in the halls of local museums. These experiences
I've never been homeschooled. I never have been homeschooled before. So you'll have to take what I say here with a grain of salt, I guess you could say. But I've known many people who have been homeschooled. I used to go to a tutor's house for English, our grammar, our writing, just all of that. I guess it's just English as a whole. For my dyslexia and trying to... Anyway, I used to go to a tutor, and she had 3 daughters, and all 3 of her daughters were homeschooled by her and a group of parents, and they all picked like their strong topic. Some of them had like 2 subjects, and they would go to each other's houses and learn that subject, and all the moms were stay-at-home moms, or I think some of them were had a job, but they weren't. Anyway, they had a job, but they had certain days off where they could teach the subject. Is I guess the best way to put it. I also had a neighbor who was homeschooled, and I actually recently just talked to her again just to get kind of an update. Who went to Lone Star. She's in the Lone Star program. Jimmy will know about that. By the way, hello, Jimmy. But she's in their homeschooling program now, and I think she's gonna be in college this next year after summer, of course. But anyway, long story short, before she even did the community college at Lone Star thing, like this video was just suggesting, she also did a online version of homeschooling, but it had the same sort of concept where it was taught by, experts or people who knew the subject well. Experts may not be necessarily the best term, but I don't really think that homeschooling is necessarily bad. And believe it or not, Texas as a state is actually somewhat loose on homeschooling regulations, which some people may say would be a problem to ensure that homeschoolers here in Texas are highly educated. But I think that switching to more personalized education through homeschooling, if done right, is probably a much, 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 much better education than somebody who went to a generic public school and received a public education. And that may need to change, or maybe we need to focus more on homeschooling. So homeschooling is a approach and an idea that I tend to favor, especially if you're someone that needs more personalized instructions to be able to comprehend and understand the topic or topics. If you have problems with multiple areas such as math and maybe science, or math and reading, or whatever the case might be. And I actually know somebody who's a streamer herself, well, she streams now, called Hildebeest, and she has homeschooled her daughter. I think she only has one daughter, and she was homeschooled herself, if I remember right. But she is a huge fan of homeschooling, and she lives in Canada. So homeschooling is done across all nations. But once again, I think it ultimately comes down to having that personalized education. And if that personalized education is done right and they receive enough information to actually understand the concept, I think it's probably better. Especially if you start talking about the student-to-teacher ratios that I think have a huge role into colleges and how well your education is. I mean, it makes sense. If you have one teacher and 30 students and you have one teacher and 5 students, the one teacher and 5 students is probably going to be able to teach a lot better than the teacher who has 30 students. So it's kind of the same when it comes to homeschooling. And I think you could even argue that most homeschool moms or homeschool teachers may even be more qualified than the actual teacher teaching the subject in a public school. So I think that's also interesting as well. Yeah. So in general, at the very basis turn, I think that public school needs to change drastically for allowing for better education. And I was going to ask Jimmy a question. Oh yeah, I remember now. I know that you're in school online, Jimmy, but did you ever look at the student-to-teacher ratio when you were trying to choose your school? I don't know if you're ever going to go to your school in person or not after COVID is away and gone and hopefully forgotten. Hopefully it doesn't become like another flu shot, even though it looks like it might be, but that's a whole nother topic. But I don't know if you ever looked at the student-to-teacher ratio for you. But I know that a lot of people do tend to look at that, have a good student-to-teacher ratio, usually like to brag about it on their sites. And also let me know if you can hear the video okay or not. I tried to play around with the settings earlier today.
Have the effect of maturing kids much more quickly and cultivating a trait of open-mindedness, as a Harvard junior and former homeschooler Claire Dixon told Business Insider. Now, this isn't me advocating for homeschooling in particular, it's just alternatives, or at least an openness to them, especially when they've been proven effective. Research suggests that homeschooled children tend to do better on standardized tests, stick around longer in college, and do better once they're enrolled. A 2009 study showed that the proportion of homeschoolers who graduated from college was around 67%, while among high school students it was 59%. There's also Montessori schools, which are more hands-on lessons. It's a non-competitive environment where older students teach younger ones. So not only are students learning, but they're learning how to teach, and seriously, that's kind of cool. You learn how to explain something to someone that doesn't quite understand it, and it encourages empathy.
This Montessori schools are in a large part based off of almost like a Boy Scout type of model, where you have older boys who teach younger boys, or the EDGE method, what Jimmy should know if he's still here. But the idea that you have to show and you have to explain, you have to teach, and then you give it to the person and you kind of monitor them as they're doing it and maybe give like, no, you need to do this instead, and then you just let them do it and see if it works. That's kind of the idea of Montessori schools. I hope I said that right. Nope, I didn't pay attention to the data. My question to you is, you were able to transfer from, which school would you choose? If you were to transfer, if I was able to transfer from my school to another school, which school would I choose? That is a good question, really. I might have went ahead and done Benedictine College. The only issue with Benedictine College is I would have to take a foreign class, and I've taken French in my high school, or in the past in my high school for like 5 years I took French. And I didn't really get fluent at all in it, and there was even times where I tried really hard to get fluent in the subject. So I would have to be able to take a foreign language and pass it with pretty good marks to be able to attend the university or to graduate from the university. So because of that, it was a little bit problemsome for me. I could have taken side language, and Lone Star offered it, and I was almost going to take it at Lone Star. And then I decided that it may have not been the smartest idea. So that's kind of where I was originally going to go to that one. But It's just issues with concerns about that. Choose George Washington? Yeah, maybe. If I passed these other 2 classes, I would probably have a good enough GPA to be able to transfer to it if I wanted. But, yeah.
Magazine states, each activity is intended to be self-correcting and hands-on. They are very cleverly designed so that the child will discover step by step what she is supposed to learn. Each activity is a building block to the next. So when children learn to trace shapes inside metal inserts that have various geometric shapes, they're unwittingly practice the fine motor skills that will enable them to pick up writing, which they typically do much faster than the average child. Equally well conceived are the mathematics activities, which work with concrete materials like beads and demonstrate that anyone is able to become comfortable with math. Now, don't get me wrong, the idea of Montessori is pretty old. Maria Montessori developed it in 1897, but it's been adapted, and it's not about turning kids into factory workers. They're known for being individually placed, most importantly. Now, we already know why some parents can't turn to homeschooling, but if Montessori schooling has been around for some time, it's proven successful, and there's already schools that use this method, why hasn't everyone heard of it? Why isn't it everywhere? I mean, most articles I've found on the topic are overwhelmingly positive, saying this method is superior in almost every regard. Some argue it's because there isn't any real definitive proof that Montessori education is better than public school. There's too many
I mean, it's not a bad idea there, Jimmy, by any means, necessarily. I don't know if I would ever want to really live in Washington, D.C., to be honest. I don't really want to do that. I know someone that actually just recently moved out of Washington, D.C. because of all the mayhem that happens there. And Washington, D.C. isn't exactly the most safest or beautiful place around the Capitol, and the Capitol itself is amazing, obviously. And I do want to visit the Capitol and one day. But yeah, I don't know if I would ever want to necessarily live in that area or not.
evaluating how a child grows, learns, what kind of job they get. I mean, it's far more than just school that impacts those things. So proving without a doubt it's better is one hell of a feat, and claims that Montessori is better would need to be validated in order to overhaul the system. There have been a number of studies done to try and determine if children can really benefit from Montessori, though, even as young as preschool age. Research on preschool education can be hard to conduct and interpret because kids who go through different preschools may differ in various ways, such as by socioeconomic status, which in of itself affects academic achievement. To get around the...
Oh, by the way, I did see your questions in a Discord. I was going to reply to you and my man Stick, who's been super active, as well as you in the Discord this past month, or last month, really. And I may even do a couple of those topics on stream. I don't know if you were answering... I think it was that question I asked about what to cover on stream or potential video ideas or whatnot. So I think several of those questions I would probably want to cover on stream as a topic, or maybe spend a week on it if it's a bigger topic, like I'm doing with this education week. But I did see your questions, and I'm going to reply to you and Stick after I finish with the stream here.
These differences. In a 2017 study, Dr. Lillard and her colleagues compared educational outcomes among 141 preschoolers who had been randomly chosen via lottery to attend either a Montessori preschool or a traditional preschool. The two groups weren't academically any different when they started school, but by the end of the 3-year study, the kids who had gone through Montessori preschools were more academically advanced and had better social skills than those who went to a traditional school. The Montessori students also reported enjoying school more. And again, I've got no idea if most, any, or all kids would benefit from this kind of learning, but it shows that traditional schooling is, at the very least, falling behind on the times. Even with alternatives, public school is still typically the easiest to access and most affordable option for millions of families.
To me, that's the core issue when it comes to public school and what we're having to deal with here. Because even if you talk about homeschool, which may seem like a very good cost-saving approach, you're still talking about many things that usually you wouldn't even necessarily think about unless if you really focus on solving the problem. And what I mean by that is if you do want to homeschool, you're going to be faced with having to feed that person at least like twice a day. You're going to have to focus on transferring the person from house to house unless if it's just a online homeschool. If it's an online homeschool, then you're going to have access to data and Wi-Fi and connections and all of this power, all of these core issues to be able to support your student or your kid with the online homeschool. And especially if you start talking about it being like maybe online and at people's houses, then you're having to talk about driving to their houses. So unless if you have someone that's going to pick up your kid, you're going to have to be the one that is driving them to all of these places. So there is many issues for homeschooling, and the practicality homeschooling has as a approach to fix this broader issue of public education. And that is one of the major problems, because public education and public schools is the easiest way to get a mass amount of people into a system of education as in the best way. So if you're someone that's living in a poorer community, you are still able to access your high school or your school, and that's a good thing. That's the whole idea of the No Child Left Behind Act and all of these other legislations that have been passed. But that's also a major issue, because once again it goes back to having to try to have a program that fits all of these different types of people into one schooling program. So if you are in a rural area of Texas, or a rural area of Alabama, or a rural area of Arkansas, or whatever you are, rural area of California, or whatever, you're going to have a lot of different people who go to this one high school, and maybe they're all from different types of environments and socioeconomic classes, is the best way to put it. And having it all into one school system and being able to teach everybody and in the best way is very hard to do. So once again, it kind of comes back to that whole system of how public education is a very hard thing to get perfect. But that's where we need to start thinking of how to change the public education, how to change schools to better fit all of these different types of people that go to that high school or go to that junior high and whatever.
Or VOTEC high schools offer some traditional courses as well as other programs like agricultural, business, computing, construction, creative, culinary, healthcare, human services, mechanical, and technical. Some fees might be affordable if you're in a county of a VOTEC high school, but at other times they can run upwards of $16,000. And don't even get me started on the cost of private schools. Even without Googling that shit, I've seen the costs go up and up to the price near expensive colleges. So where do we go from here? Should every parent put their child in Montessori, VOTEC, homeschool them, or eat ramen forever so that their child can go to private school? No, because education should be free and easily available. So I'm not going to say that an alternative is a permanent solution. A temporary one maybe, and if a parent believes that Montessori, VOTEC, private schooling, homeschooling, boarding school, whatever is best for their child, well, then that's their child, so who the hell am I to judge? Unless, of course, that school is abusive. But the only permanent solution we're going to see here is education reform on a massive scale. I'm not saying all at once, but it definitely needs to happen sooner rather than later. Some articles, such as one from The Atlantic entitled America's Not So Broken System, seem to downplay this issue. They're far from the only news source that insists the root of the problem is not incompetent design, as it is so frequently alleged. Nor is it stasis. Rather, it is the twofold challenge of complexity and scale. And here's where I have to disagree. The problem is all of these things. The design may not be incompetent, but we're relying on a system that values specific traits sought in the 1800s. It was competent then, it's not anymore. While some things do change, such as training given to teachers and history books growing thicker with time, many things don't. Budget cuts are still rampant, teachers still protest, and in Oklahoma the budget cuts are so severe that in 2018, 30% of public school students went to a school with no art classes. So how is this encouraging creativity? How is this not stasis? Calling it hysteria or saying we shouldn't talk about building from scratch, sure. I'm not saying fire all the teachers, bulldoze the schools, unenroll everyone, and let's take the time to do a redo. I don't think anyone is, and I don't want you walking away with the impression that everything you've learned is useless. Even learning that the mitochondria is the powerhouse of the cell isn't entirely useless. It's fascinating to learn how things work, and those lessons that introduce kids to science and sparks their interest, those are interesting things. We need biologists out there, Though I guess you could argue it also can turn some kids off to certain topics, being forced into them rather than feeling they have a choice. There's two sides to every coin here. But rather than ingrain different mathematical formulas into each kid's head, what if we taught them financial planning in a math class? What if in an English class we had lessons on how to make resumes and understand contracts for apartments or homes? Why can't history class explain the foundations of our political parties, how to vote, and our human rights? Again, I'm not saying no schools do this now, but mine sure as hell didn't, and I know without a doubt I'd be miles ahead if I did. The first step to make change is to be aware of a problem, and then talk about it, and then talk to our government, talk to our schools, and make it known that this is something we want. This is something our future children need. So, with all of that being said, that's where I'm going to end today's video. Let me know your thoughts.
Alrighty, so that's that first video we were going to watch here, and I'll have to reshape everything once it decides to work. Yes, it is. Alrighty, we'll go to our first article I have up here that we were going to do yesterday, but we ran into some issues with time and such. So let me reshape this real quick so that we can get into today's episode. Okay. So, this is an article by Breeden Patrick Blowers. We'll go ahead and start our music here. Alrighty. So, this is an article by Breeden Patrick Blowers, and it states, the education system in America is broken. Here's how we can fix it before it's too late. Updated for COVID. As a former teacher in both public and private middle and high schools, I witnessed many education shortcomings firsthand. Even before COVID concerns, schools were headed in the wrong direction. Now that school systems reopening is literally a public health concern, and teachers are refusing to risk their lives for a paltry paycheck, many parents and students are questioning whether formal education in America is even worth it. Once I removed myself from the classroom for a good few years ago and went back to the private sector, I got some clarity on how schools in America could improve. I don't expect many of these ideas to be adopted by the powers that be. However, recent circumstances have given us golden opportunities to question everything taught K through 12 and college. We're going to jump down first. We'll go back up. We'll start here. Here's how the current leadership is majority of schools. You have principals, assistant principals, department chairs, guidance counselors, blah, 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 blah. One person takes ownership. We'll go down. Okay. Also, there are project managers that have voted back into service every year by parents and students, not a school board that's too removed from the day-to-day. Now that we should create some motivation, creativity, and accountability. Now to hold teachers accountable. You were informed ahead of time when your once a semester observation was going to be, so you saved your best lesson for that one day. Bribed your class to be on their best behavior, and then pulled out all the bells and whistles so the assistant principal or department head sitting in the back of the room could check all the boxes on their standardized form. Teachers reading this, I know I'm keeping it real here. Now imagine this, instead of those ineffective observation that teachers dread and administrators perform out of duty, what if the teachers had drop-ins from former or current students? Only teachers with experience in the same subject matter can review a current teacher. Follow-up would be a mandatory, but also informal with suggestions on how that teacher could improve and collaborate brainstorm sessions. So let's talk about an interesting idea. When you're teaching a classroom and you're teaching your particular subject matter, you're going to be with a group of other teachers that are also teaching that same subject matter. So if you're a history teacher, you're going to be in a group with other history or social study teachers. And that's when you get together to make lesson plans and come up with ideas for the classroom, come up with a comprehensive plan to fix things and to allow for a better education for your classroom and for the other teachers' classrooms, a better educational program as a whole. So the idea of using those same teachers as going into your classroom for a review seems like an interesting idea. It seems like it would put more emphasis on trying to solve the idea of evaluating teachers and holding teachers accountable. Although I'm not particularly sure that would necessarily work if you use the same teachers, because the same teachers would want to make sure that they're able to perform at their best levels, so that they're able to hang on a second. I'm going to turn background sound off. We don't need it. Anyway, they would have to make sure that they would want to make sure that all of their teachers pass with flying colors, so that it looks better for everybody as a whole concept. So you would almost have to use teachers at another school, the other high school, or the other junior high, or something like that. Or if you use past teachers or things like that, it could potentially work. But I think you might be running into the same sort of issues over time. I don't know. Okay. Let's go down a little bit. Commission more student monitors and give them the power to actually dole out consequences. This becomes a learning experience for both sides, training future leaders in important soft skills like conflict management and negotiation. Now, don't get me wrong, I believe any student who commits a serious act like assault, hate speech, discrimination, or threats of violence should be referred to counseling and disciplined severely. Break out the traditional classroom box. I had that experience to co-teach a few classes, and I found those experiences to be among the best for students' engagement and for my own sanity. Students need more hybrid STEM classrooms, more classes that combine the arts, and more real world becomes a classroom experience. This is another area where proper homeschooling gets it right. Education needs to be more holistic and less like a soiled factory. The Renaissance and Age of Enlightenment didn't happen from people following a strict bell schedule. It was more like a flywheel approach to learning, with each discipline informing and building upon the others. Montessori schools do some of this in elementary education, but those concepts need to be expanded to secondary and even higher education. And we were just reading about that, or listening, not reading, but we were just listening to the idea of Montessori schools not too long ago. We'll go to our next article by the great HuffPost, where we're going to get some ideas based off of that. It states here, 7 ways to repair the public education system. 1. Stop viewing our kids as numbers. Today, in many school systems, there has been an implementation of pure pupil spending. This focuses schools to run inadequate staffed due to enrollment at the school. I think this goes back to the general idea of trying not to view our public education as factories and trying to update the approach, our style to education to allow for better results is kind of what I'm going for here. And I also think that has to do with funding as well. I don't think that all of the schools necessarily receive funding in the same way, because it would probably depend on states. And if anybody knows if that's true or not, I would love to know your answer on that one. But I'm assuming that it's probably mostly to do with the state laws of education, or what their state education board says on what their role is for statistics to keep up with funding and to receive more funding through proper tests, standardized scores, or classroom size, or whatever the implementation of it would be. But I am not positive if that's how it works. So if I am wrong, then someone can please let me know on that one. But we'll go to our second point here. Do away with the Common Core. Being introduced into the public education system and working for 9 years, I have seen several different names and implementations of various curriculum in an attempt to change the old ways of teaching into new ways. This is all wrong. Real teaching does not require long written out standards, which are nothing more than long frivolous lists of jargon. The school system probably paid some multi-billion-dollar company to create. I think they got a little bit fictitious, is I guess a word, at the end there, are trying to seem a little bit more passionate about the issue than really what they needed to say. Not that that's necessarily a bad thing, but in the general sense, I think that getting rid of the Common Core programs is something we talked about on the first episode. And I don't know if Jimmy's still here, but I'll be interested to hear his whole opinion on Common Core. I know in the state of Texas, you have to take a certain amount of hours on, you have to take a certain amount of hours on each subject area. So you have to take like 6 hours of English, you have to take 6 hours of math, you have to take 6 hours of biology, you have to take 6 hours of government, blah, 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 blah. Those aren't the exact numbers. But Texas mandates that if you're a student in Texas for community college or college itself, and then it goes down into high school as well, where they set the subjects and how many hours the subject has to be taught for. And you have your Common Core programs that are usually math and English and science classes. And I believe in most public educations for high school, you're able to choose which core science you want to take. I went to a private high school, so we took different science courses. We took biology, chemistry, and usually physics are a second biology or a second chemistry per a year. And we switched each term, so we didn't necessarily stick to just one science. But I believe in a generic public school in Texas, you have to choose your common science you take. Jimmy says here, yeah, most schools no longer require SAT test. Oh, really? I thought SAT tests were still a thing. That's not so much Common Core, that's more to do with standardized testing, but we are going to get to talking a little bit about standardized tests here pretty soon. Looks like somebody just joined the Discord. Yep. Thank you for joining the Discord. I don't know if you want me to say your name or not, so I'll just be quiet on that one. But we do have a question of the day. I haven't posted a question of the day in a long time now. I'm very bad about that. I used to be very good, but I don't know. But I'm going to reply to Jimmy's comments he had in there not too long ago. And anyway, I wanted to make the Discord a little bit better, but we'll see. Okay, I lost my train of thought. Anyway, standardized testing, yeah. So we're actually going to get to talk a little bit about standardized testing on today's episode. And I think that standardized testing has a huge role to play on how subjects are taught, especially in the state of Texas. I don't think that every state does standardized tests. And when you're talking about SATs, that would usually be done to get into a college. So if you're saying that a lot of out-of-state colleges are colleges that you looked at didn't require a SAT test, then that's something that could change the way public education is taught too. Even though the STAR test, or whatever you want to call it, is different, or the standardized test is different than the SAT test, SAT tests are still a standardized test to get into a college, so it's the same sort of concept, is basically what I'm trying to say here. Anyway, the third idea. give homework. The education system is moving away from giving students homework. This is an outrage, I know. How else can a student practice what they have learned for a day if no one does not complete homework? How can one assure that the concepts are grasped? I mean, in my experience, there wasn't a day where the teacher didn't give homework. Sometimes the teacher would feel a little bit gracious and want to give us homework for a week, or when they give us homework for that day where they usually gave the homework, but give us it on Thursday instead of Tuesday or whatever it was, and give us the weekend to do it or whatever the idea was. But in my experience of public education, or education in general, and I'm going back to Lone Star and college now, there wasn't really days where homework was missed. But I can understand the general concept of homework and that homework is good, and if there is a trend of high schools or public education giving less homework, then okay, whatever. I can see that point. I don't really see how that would be a fix necessarily, because it's only just re-endorsing what you're already teaching or the teaching style you have. The idea of just giving more homework but doing the same thing is not going to fix the issue. So, I mean, I understand the point, but I don't necessarily think that that is a one-step fix by any means. Their fourth idea here, get rid of teacher evaluative tools. And we actually just read about that, so that's kind of interesting that this person also thought of a similar idea. Well, let's see what they have to say about it. There are several ways of evaluating teachers which are subjective. Oh, okay. Yeah, I get it. There are principals and assistant principals who use the evaluative tool as a means of hurting teachers and ruining their records. The evaluative system is supposed to be non-biased evaluative tool. On the contrary, it is entirely subjective. Those are principals who have never been teachers and have no knowledge of how a classroom works and acquires information. Now, why is a person who does not possess this knowledge allowed to evaluate a teacher? Okay, I'll give that point. We just read a little bit about that. I think that a lot of assistant principals do know a lot about teaching. I know in my experience of student teaching, when I did it at Lone Star, at a college, or not a college, at a junior high. Was it junior high? No, it was high school. It was a high school in Conroe. The assistant principal there was very good at understanding the teacher's role and how to evaluate teachers. But once again, that's more of an anecdotal experience and probably not an everyday experience to what most assistant principals are like. And I do think that the evaluative tools in general are probably more subjective as they should be. And as we read from the previous article, they aren't necessarily that effective by any means either. So their fifth idea here, stop giving express teaching degrees. With the flood of education, with the flood of the education field, with new teachers due to insane instability in the job market, has led to people being in the field who don't have a real passion for the craft. These people pollute classroom and have a high turnover rate due to their lack of love of the profession. Okay. I don't really have anything really to add on that one. I mean, it makes sense. Teaching is not a field that you can generally just go into and expect to be highly paid or expect to be, happy with just being a teacher just because it's a teacher. Teaching takes a lot of work and in general is something that is a good concept, a good idea, can be rewarding, but once again, it takes a lot of work. So having a speedy degree just to become a teacher and those teachers not necessarily staying does make some sense. Great equals or if I probably butchered that. I'm gonna call you equal if that's okay. on Twitch says, maybe if we pay teachers a better salary, the good ones would stick around. We're actually going to get a little bit into the salary argument, if I remember right, for the tabs I have up. If not, I'm going to be talking about it tomorrow, as well as on Friday for the last stream on education for this week. Because I'm doing a series of these, obviously, because it's part 2. But anyway, before I just keep blabbering on and make no sense, I do think in general, Eagle, I think if we pay teachers a little bit better, they would tend to want to stick around for a lot longer and probably even teach better. Because teaching can really become a hard thing to do. Because especially if you talk about teachers that have been there for a long time, you obviously have the personalities and teachers that are very good at their job and love their job. They have their bad days, but in general, they're just so passionate about it. They're so loving for their students. You know, you probably know someone like that in your life, or maybe one of your teachers was like that, where even though the job isn't necessarily super rewarding and they would like to be paid more, they aren't necessarily sad about it. But then you obviously have your teachers that have been there a long time and are starting to burn out. And even though they were great teachers, and maybe they still are great teachers, they're getting burned out because they're having to teach the same thing, the same standardized program. They're having to stress out about their students passing their standardized test. That's why you have all these news stories that come out, usually a couple a year, of a teacher getting caught for giving students, questions to a standardized test like the STAR test, so that their classroom can pass and that they can be paid and stick around for next year. And I kind of combined multiple things into that explanation, but I think if you pay teachers a little bit better, especially for certain states, it would make a huge, it would help the situation. I think it really would. And you obviously have the argument, especially for my dad, who argues that teachers are paid enough because, they don't have to work summers unless they choose to, obviously. And because they don't necessarily have to work at summers. And anyway, he thinks that they're paid enough, to say it in a summary. And in a way, I can see what he's saying, but I don't think we're talking about the same sort of issue when you talk about teacher salary. There's a whole arguments on both sides, and no side is 100% correct on what should be done. But yeah, I don't know if I made any sense about that at all. But Equal says here, my wife is 7th and 8th grade teacher. The kids these days make it hard to teach. The lack of parenting is really showing in our schools. Yeah, I mean, in general, I can see that from statistics that I've looked at and just talking with teachers. Because like I've said already, probably like 6 times now, I'm in college for special education. And in Texas. That's the state I'm in, obviously. And I would get my certification for Texas and blah, 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 blah. So I'd be teaching special education in Texas and whatnot. So through my experience in my community college and in my college now, I've talked with many teachers and talked to many people who are student teaching now, because I'm mixed in with people, because special education is a little different in how the degree plan works. I'm mixed in with people who are like seniors and are doing their observation hours right now. So I think that's a very interesting thing. If I was just doing like a reading teacher, I wouldn't really be in those classes. So I think that's kind of interesting because in general, a special needs teacher needs to be able to understand all subjects, I guess you could say, at least have a little bit of knowledge of it. Let's talk about my dad's take. Did he have to have a degree to have his job? He's an engineer, mechanical engineer. So yes, he has a degrees, I think. Maybe just 1 degree, but anyway, he does have a degree to have his job. It took my wife 6 years for her degree and another 5 to clear her credentials, which is done now. Well, what does she teach, if you don't mind me asking? But yeah, 6 years for a degree is a very long time, especially if you start talking about student loans and the price of college. The more I think about this, the more I think I'm going to be spending another week at least on education, because we're not even getting into the college and how to fix colleges. I think I'm going to need a little bit more streams on this one. I don't know if y'all guys would still be interested on it, but I'm definitely willing to do more streams on education for sure. Anyway, but yeah, if it took her 6 years and then another 5 years to get a certification license or classes to get the certification, because I assume she probably had to take some sort of class to get her license or something. You're starting to talk about a mass amount of debt probably that she had to pay or get loans from. Equal says, so how would he feel if they cut his pay down to $50K a year? She has a special ed degree and another education degree from NAU. Technically, she has 2 bachelors. Oh, okay. That's awesome. So yeah, she probably knows a little bit about what I'm trying to talk about here with being a special education teacher. I still have about 2 years left until I'm going to have to take until I'm done with college, and about a year until I have to get like my certification and start actually teaching in the classroom for observation hours and student teaching and blah 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 blah. But in California, you have to pass the test, then teach for 5 years to clear the credential. Okay, so you live in California then? Okay, yeah, I live in Texas, and I could be mistaken on this, but I don't believe you have to have a minimum amount of teaching to get the certification. I think that there's a brief period of time where you're essentially a mentor to somebody, and then you have to pass the test, and then you can start teaching. But usually in the state of Texas, first-year teachers are kind of just thrown into the classroom, and they're not necessarily ready for it. And if I'm understanding the way it works in California from what you said, and you can definitely correct me if I'm wrong, is she working with somebody for that 5 years, or is she still acting as a teacher? She just has to teach for 5 years before she gets her main credentials. I don't know if that made sense, but yeah, I don't believe there's a minimum amount of teaching years or teaching hours or whatever to have a certification. But I do know you have to have a minimum amount of student observation and teaching hours to get your degree. But I'm not so sure about certification yet. But I don't believe in the state of Texas it's like a year-long process or anything like that to pass the test and get certified in being a special education teacher or being a teacher in general. Equal says, yes, but in California you have to be observed for 5 years by herself. She has to teach for 5 years, but the credential is now good in any state, which a lot aren't. Oh, okay, yeah, okay. Okay. Yeah, because in the state of Texas, for special education and probably for education teaching in general, you get your certification in the state of Texas, and I believe your Texas certification could also be used in Arkansas. And those are like the only 2 states, I think there may be three, where if you have a Texas certification, you can also teach in their state. But I would have to pass a separate test or a separate certification if I wanted to teach in Kansas, or if I wanted to teach in Florida, or if I wanted to teach in Oregon, or whatever the state you want to call. I would have to pass their separate test or their separate certification to be able to teach there. So Texas is very narrowed in having to get your license or your certification just to teach in that state. So that's a very interesting. That would maybe a plus to California system just a little bit, but that does seem like a very long time as well. And I could see having some very large money issues for that amount of time before you're actually able to secure yourself in a classroom. Right, Arizona is the same way. You can have a CERT there, but it doesn't transfer. here is now nationwide. Right. Yeah. I see what you're saying now for sure. That's not necessarily a bad thing to have by any means. But like I was just saying, I could see that being a problem. A potential problem. I would have to think a little bit more about that though. I mean, if you think about it, you could be a lawyer in the same amount of time. Yeah, exactly. That's what I'm saying. Like, that is our doctor or something, that is a lot of money to stay in college for that long. A lot of money to get the certification. Because make no mistake, there's money in having these licenses and everything. Then that's also a lot of time in general. So by the time she's actually able to be a teacher and not be observed by the time she's a single teacher, like a teacher, not like, and I'm not making sense here, but by the time she's alone in the classroom and doesn't have to be observed, she could have been a doctor or a lawyer, as you just said there. And that does seem like that you could run into some issues. Not a student teacher. Yeah, that's a good way of putting it. I was thinking student teacher, but I'm like, man, if I'm still a student teacher in 4 years from now, I'm like, man, that's another thing. I could see that being very very hard on the mind for wanting to, because I don't know your wife or anything, but let's just put it this way. College is not necessarily super fun to me. I don't really like having to take unnecessary classes to get my degree plan for something I want to teach. I just want to do it. I would rather there be like an apprenticeship almost, where I'm able to be in a classroom under somebody and learn that way instead of have to take unnecessary classes or be in college and get into debt and all this other stuff. And so college is very hard, and I don't particularly like it too much. I like the social interactions I have with people, the friends I get to make, but it's not always that's the best part of college. But there's a lot of bad parts, and I could see that being very very problemsome. Because by the time you're actually not a student teacher, yeah. I can just see that being very hard on the mind. Equal says, it's hard for her to look at my degree and say, why do you get paid double and only had to go to school for 4 years? Yeah, right. Because if she went to school for, I believe it was 9 years, if I'm remembering right. No, 11 years, if I'm thinking right, if I remember the numbers. That's yeah. Okay, that is crazy for sure. That is bonkers almost. That is crazy. Like, I don't know what your degree is or anything, but yeah. Ooh. Like, because I think I was looking yesterday. Yesterday we looked a lot of general statistics on colleges, or not general statistics on public education and how much teachers get paid and compared states to states. And California, I believe, was in $80,000 to $85,000 per year, if I remember right. It was either 85 or 65 per year for that state. And then you compared it to Texas, that was in like the 50 range. And obviously, to live in California and to live in Texas are completely two different lifestyles. So, I mean, it's like, whoop, okay, you're talking about the price of living between California and Texas, and they're only paid, maybe like $30,000 more. There's also a problem with that on teachers' salaries for public education, and not necessarily professors or things like that. Altogether, it's altogether school 5 and 5. Then for the credential, right, yeah. I have a BS in accounting. Low, it's $50,000 unless you have a master's. Okay. Wait, so you're saying, okay. Okay. You're saying it's $50,000 without a master's in California to be a teacher in, let's just say, high school. If that's true, that is a little bit surprising. Maybe it just assumed more people had a master's, or at least that she was, or I'm just completely thinking opposite numbers right now. I could just be dumb. It's possible I'm just being dumb here. Eagle says she makes less than $55K with 8 years of teaching experience. Yeah, that is terrible. That is absolutely terrible. I don't really know what to say about that because that's pretty bad. Because you're talking about she was 7th and 8th grade teacher, had 10 years of teaching plus whatever for the credential, makes $50K a year and 8 years of teaching experience. Well, she makes $55K. Woo. If we move to Texas right now in Dallas, she would get a $25K increase and I would get a $10K increase. That's interesting. I knew that California was getting a little bit problemsome, and that's why a lot of people are moving out of California. And their governor right now is actually in a recall vote. I don't think that's till a couple more months now, if my thinking's right. But I know that there's a big push to get the governor out even before the 2022 election. And if somehow the governor does make it to 2022, he's still going to have to run again and go through the whole process there. So I know a lot of people are moving out of California and to Texas and Florida and I think it's Kansas or Arkansas is what I was hearing. That a lot of people are moving to those states because of, are moving to those states. We were going to move to Dallas a few months ago, but we bought a house here. I wanted to move to Waco and hang out with Chip and Joanna Gaines. I don't know if I know who Chip and Joanna are. Maybe I do, and I'm just brain farting right now or not thinking right. But Waco is where Baylor University is, which is actually a decent college in Texas. Similar to the college I'm at really here. Even though Baylor is technically a Christian university and where I am not is not a Christian university. But anyway, that doesn't really matter. They have a show, House Remodeling, on HGTV. Okay, is that what the... I think I know what you're talking about now. Is it the house flip show where they have to go in and they buy the house for cheap and then they go in and renovate the house and sell it again for more expensive and try to make money? I think that's what that show is, if I remember right. This is actually one idea we talked about on the last stream, about the concept of trade schools. It's called Fixer Upper. Yeah, I definitely think I've seen that show before. There's this other show that I have in my mind too, but it's like Flip It or Sell It or Sell It or Flip It or something like that. That's also on HGTV, I believe. It comes on after House Hunters. Anyway, Our Property Brothers. All those shows are a little bit similar, but not necessarily the same. But the whole idea about trade schools is also something I think is very interesting. Because, believe it or not, I've heard a lot of people talk about trade schools more recently and wanting to pursue a trade school education. Anyway, I just got sidetracked. It was Flip or Flop? Yeah. I don't know if you necessarily have Discord or not, but I'll go ahead and drop the Discord link just in case you do. But you could definitely join the Discord if you want. You definitely don't have to, but we could definitely talk a lot more about university expenses and trying to fix university education as a stream topic for sure, because it is something that I'm going to have to focus on. Originally, I was just going to do this week for the educational topic, but I think I might expand it by another week to next week, or maybe just move it to the end of this month. Anyway, we'll see. I have a couple of major topics that I want to talk about and spend some time discussing, because my whole idea, what I do here as on stream, is I try to learn things live on air, answer your questions, read your chat, and everything like that. So I don't know everything, and I don't pretend that I know everything. So basically, I just try to learn live on air and come up with solutions or ideas. But we're going to read this next article on 4 big ideas on fixing American schools. Ooh, this article has a lot of ads here. Okay, we'll just start from the top. Why not? In the American education system, the kids are not all right. Recent tests show that high schoolers haven't improved in math or reading for the past 20 years, and middle schoolers have gone backwards in their comprehension skills. All this comes after years of expensive education programs like the No Child Left Behind and Race to the Top. Like we discussed a little bit today and yesterday, the No Child Left Behind Act is something that seems very good in nature, but wasn't necessarily implemented the best, and has led to some controversy, even though you would think the whole concept of No Child Left Behind would be a great idea. But I guess not. I don't know if it's a hard concept to really understand, because the base concept of it is a good idea, but the implementation of the idea isn't necessarily the best. So that's a interesting mark. Expert educators contend that schools need to infuse more flexibility, creativity, and community into their practices in order for a diverse student body to succeed. We asked them to lay out the steps for this radical classroom transformation. We need to turn away from defining students by deficit, disorder, and disability, which is currently how the system measures neurological conditions. Instead, embrace individuals' interests and strengths. Organizations in countries like the United Kingdom and Russia are building models where an educator can apply a student's fascination with, let's say, aviation, to real-life math and guide them to a career as a pilot. So this is the idea about personalized education. Jimmy here says, yes, lots of cheating, many students using Chegg to get the answers. For standardized testing, is that what you're talking about, Jimmy? Because I know that there's several things. There's Quizlet for online tests. Most online programs use Quizlet for their tests because teachers have a hard time making up test questions, it seems. And then you have Socratic on your phone, where you're able to take a picture of the question and it goes online and gives you the answer, blah, blah, blah. And then you have Chegg, and then you have Bubbly or whatever it's called. And then you have another thing, you have this thing, you have that thing. You have so many different ways that somebody can access the internet to come up with an answer, or to cheat on a test, or to cheat on a problem. So I think that's probably what Jimmy is talking about there. The only way to prevent COVID-19 from deepening inequality for an entire generation is to equip families to support learning at home. The most recent study from McKinsey estimates that Black students may fall behind by 10.3 months and Hispanic students by 9.2 months due to school closures. But if we can get teachers to work together with parents to set learning goals, be supportive, and check in with each other more, we would reach a tipping point in changing the system for good. Yeah, I mean, true. I don't really think you can argue much against that. The whole idea about the breakdown in the school pipeline I'm trying to think. School to prison pipeline. That whole idea is kind of what they're talking about there. And I think there's a lot of data to suggest that as being a issue and being a potential problem. So I don't really see too much of a concern with that necessarily. But we'll continue on here. City schools can break down walls with natural and cultural environments and take advantage of the social, emotional, and health-related benefits of learning from rooftop parks, cemeteries, and museums. Recent research finds that children who experience fresh air and sunshine during or between formal lessons tend to perform better academically in the pandemic. This may be even more true. Green schoolyards, American and Europe, forest kindergarten, and lighthouses that others should follow. So the idea of implementing more outside learning and different types of learning environments. Once again, not necessarily a bad idea. The only thing you run into problems here is that not every high school or not every public school is going to have the ability to have outside learning environments. In Texas, most high schools in Texas are going to have some sort of outdoor ability to have something. But if you talk about New York or Chicago and high schools that are in there, you're probably not going to have access to much outdoor space to have learning environments in the outdoors. But the general concept of it isn't necessarily a bad idea, because implementing more outside learning or change of pace and trying to keep students' interest that way is not a bad thing necessarily. I know that one of the people in my Boy Scout troop and Jimmy's Boy Scout troop built an outdoor space at the high school there that he went to. And I don't really think it was ever necessarily used as a classroom, although we had a part, like benches around this like stone circle thing, that the idea was it could be used as an outside classroom if needed or whatnot. But from my experience of talking to people who went to that high school, I don't think that it ever was really used as an outdoor area for a classroom or anything like that. The New York Times says here what students are saying about how to improve American education. Earlier this month, the Program for International Student Assessment announced that the performance of American teachers in reading and math has been stagnant since 2000. Other recent studies revealed that 2/3 of American children were non-proficient readers, and that the achievement gap of reading between high and low performers is whittling. To weigh in on these findings and tell us their suggestions for how they would improve the American education system. Our prompt received nearly 300 comments. This was clearly a subject that many teenagers were passionate about. Blah, 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 blah. Let's get to what they said. One of the biggest flaws in the American education system is the amount of pressure that students have on them to do well in school so that they can get into a good college. Because students have this kind of pressure on them, they purely focus on doing well rather than actually learning and taking something valuable away from what they are being taught. Yeah, I can see that. There was definitely some experience I had of student peers, who were really focused on SAT scores and really focused on trying to perform at their very, very, very best so that they could get into their college of their dreams or get into a college that they really wanted to go to. But we'll keep going. As a freshman and someone who has a tough home life, I can agree that this is one of the main causes as to why I do poorly on some things in school. I have been frustrated about a lot that I am excited to learn in school because they expect us to learn so much information in such a little time that we end up forgetting about half of it anyway. The expectations that I wish that my teachers and school have of me is that I am only human and that I make mistakes. So again, it looks like they're talking about the pressure the school puts on them. This is talking about some technology, that they want more technology. We're going to go down a little bit and just pick a random one here. My second grade classmate, goodness. Anyway. My second grade class made learning easy because of the way my teacher would teach us. My teacher would give us a song we had to remember to learn nouns, verbs, adjectives, pronouns, etc., which helped me remember their definitions until I could remember it without the song. She had a little key things that helped us learn math because all we wanted to be on we had math because we all wanted to be on a harder key than each other. What? I don't know. She also sang us our spelling words, and then spelling of the word from the song would help us remember that. They're basically just talking about phonics there. Wow. I think someone's drag racing out here or something. Anyway, so that was just some general thoughts about students. Not necessarily something too shocking per se, but I thought I would include that here just to give some general feedback based off of what students are seeing in their classroom or suggesting or whatever you want to say there. But we're going to get into our next video here of this guy who has an idea to fix the education system in 2020. Although we are in 2021 now, this is still relevant to what we can do to potentially help the situation. I am going to reshape our video here. Alrighty. Let's play this video.
The U.S. education system is failing, but what can we do to fix it? I think the solution is maybe we should just spend more money on education. And while I understand where you're coming from, the U.S. education system is failing, but what can we do to fix it? If you're like most people, you think the solution is maybe we should just spend more money on education. And while I understand where you're coming from, it's actually not going to work. And I'll show you why in this video. But before we get to solutions, I first need to prove to you that the American education system is failing, if for some reason you don't believe it. Let's start by looking at the proficiency test that high school seniors have to take. If we use the most recent data available, we find that only 25% of students are proficient or better in math, and 37% in reading. That means that 3 out of every 4 students are not even proficient in math. To me, that is fairly disturbing, but it gets even worse. In that same year, 38% of students were below basic achievement in math and 28% in reading. So what this means is that you have more students who are below basic achievement in math than you do who are proficient or better in math. And that is really messed up. I do not see how you can look at that and say our education system is doing well, especially when you consider the fact that proficiency exams are things that we create, our own standards. By our own standards, we're not doing well, but it doesn't stop there, because there's a thing called grade inflation, which makes matters, in my opinion, even worse. Business Insider points out that in 1998, about 39% of high schoolers had an A average. By 2016, the rate had increased to 47%. Meanwhile, the average SAT scores fell. So in the past 20 years, students have been getting higher grades but lower test scores. And that shows that grades are not really indicative of how students are learning. If you think they are, I'm sorry, grade inflation shows that's not the case. If you need more evidence, look at this study talking about grade inflation in high schools. They found a fairly disturbing trend. Specifically, that while grade inflation occurs overall at most schools, it is more pronounced at the more affluent schools, or the schools that tend to have more resources, the richer schools, to put it bluntly. This graph shows that in just the past 10 years, grade inflation has occurred more at more affluent schools than at less affluent schools. And the issue here is probably fairly obvious. Suppose I'm going to one of those less affluent or poorer schools, I work really hard, I get a really good grade. And then I'm applying to colleges, but my GPA is being compared to students who went to more affluent schools. The issue there being that their schools tend to give out higher grades on average. It doesn't mean they're better students or they worked harder, they just have higher grades because of grade inflation. So I am less likely to get into that college because my school was not inflating grades nearly as much. That is a really big issue. And again, in case you think grades are actually indicative of what they're learning, consider the fact, as this report says, that more than 1/3 of the students who received B's from their teachers in Algebra 1 failed to score proficient on the end of course exams. So just because students are getting higher grades now than they did
I think this ultimately comes down to the pressure teachers have on standardized tests. I don't know if Equal is still here or not, but I'll be interested to know if California does have a standardized test like Texas does, where they test you on math and reading, and I believe science, if I remember right. I know the SAT has a science course for it for college and whatnot. But I don't know if California necessarily does standardized tests or not. But the way Texas does, a lot of times teachers are graded, for lack of better words, are evaluated on how well their class averages on a standardized test, or how well they perform, how well their classroom does on a standardized test.
10 or 20 years ago, that does not mean that they're more proficient in the material, because in many cases they're not. So hopefully you're convinced the US education system is broken. Now, how do we fix it? Well, the answer is not money. I hate to break it to you, but it's not quite that simple. You see, most people think we can just increase spending in education and we're going to do better. And while I understand where you're coming from, the data does not really support that. For example, if we compare the educational outcomes in the United States to other OECD countries, we can see highlighted here, the United States generally ranks in the mid-teens. So we're not doing horribly, but there's a good amount of room for improvement. But now if we look at how much each of those countries actually spends on education per student, the United States is near the very top. There are only a few countries that spend more than we do. So we are outspending many of these countries, and yet they're outperforming us fairly frequently. So money can't really be the solution. Now, I understand spending more money might not be a bad thing necessarily, but who wants to pay more taxes? Rather than just spend more money endlessly on education, let's instead focus on where we're spending the money. Let's reallocate our sources and make it more effective. For example, let's look at teachers' salary. If you look at the average salary of teachers in the United States and compare it to other countries around the world, whether it be elementary school teachers or high school teachers, you'll actually see that the United States ranks in the top 10 both times. So you might look at that and say that we're paying our teachers fine, we don't need to address this. But there is another part to this that we need to consider, and that is how much more teachers could make if they went into a different career. Specifically, when you do that, you find that the United States is actually lagging behind the OECD average. Essentially, this graph means that someone in the United States becoming a teacher will earn 67% of what they could have earned if they had gone to a different career with the same level of education. Consider that to Finland or Denmark or Australia, all of which have higher than 80%. And the OECD average is 79%. So becoming a teacher in the United States is not just about how much you make, it's how much you could make had you gone to a different career with the same level of education. And the issue here is that if you want to get really qualified teachers, you need to make them competitive. If you're going to lose 33% of your income by becoming a teacher, you're probably going to choose to do something else. Obviously, that's not true for everyone, and we still have a number of good teachers.
So this goes into the teacher's salary pay that we were just discussing a little bit earlier. And I actually didn't really think about this idea that much. But yesterday's stream, we discussed the idea of how much money we spend per student on teachers. How much money we spend per student for our education program and whatnot. And we were one of the highest nations out of that OECD, our main first world nations that he is talking about here. But if we just spend less and spend our money better, we would have more money to spend, or to not really spend, but to give teachers for their salary. And that could be an interesting idea. And I didn't really necessarily think about that.
We don't have as big a pool to choose from. Just statistically speaking, we're not going to have as good teachers because they're being drawn to other careers. And deciding to do something instead of teaching because of the money is not a bad thing. I'm not saying it is. If you choose to go into a different career because you're concerned about your income, that is completely understandable. You have to provide for yourself and your family. So let's not pretend that they're just in it for the money, because money is a fairly important thing nowadays. We should just make it easier for them to choose to become a teacher so they don't have to give up quite so much. That being said, if we're going to pay teachers more, we have to make sure we have better teachers. And one of the things we need to do about this is looking at teachers' unions. Now, I'm not going to advocate for getting rid of teachers' unions completely, because I'm not going to do that. I know many of my conservative friends don't like teachers' unions. I see where they're coming from, but they also have some benefits. However, one area where they are detrimental is when it comes to firing bad teachers. Teachers agree with this overall. if we look at teachers who were surveyed, where they're asked if teachers' unions make it harder to fire bad teachers, 63% of them, whether they be unionized or non-unionized, actually agree with that. So the majority of teachers do recognize that teachers' unions make it more difficult to fire bad teachers. So that is something that needs to be addressed. If we want teaching to be a more competitive career, then it has to be competitive. Keeping bad teachers is not a way to do that. In addition to that, we need to have a way to properly evaluate how well teachers are doing. Now, this is a little bit difficult, and I'm not entirely sure.
Once again, we get into this whole debate. We've seen this several times now, where one of the attempts to make a better education system is to change the way teachers are evaluated and come up with a system that gives better results for the students and for the individual classroom at hand here. I'll talk a little bit about teacher unions. Teacher unions are not necessarily a bad thing by any means, I don't think. Doesn't make it harder to fire bad teachers, probably, just like any other union makes it a little bit harder. But I'll have to see what he says more about unions to give kind of a full reputation to kind of what he's coming from.
Sure the method here, but one thing we need to do is link teacher pay to their evaluations. This study looked at over 100 districts across the United States, and they found that nearly half of the districts they sampled offer some form of performance pay based on a teacher's evaluation rating. However, there were only 16 districts where a teacher's evaluation dictated the size of their salary increase. So what that means is that in the vast majority of districts, if your pay was in fact influenced by your evaluation, you would get the same pay increase if you were marked a good teacher or a great teacher, which is really not the way it has to go. Again, if we want teaching to be competitive, then the best teachers should get the best pay. It should not be about seniority as it kind of currently is, it should be about effectiveness. And yes, I understand evaluating teachers is a bit difficult. I'm not sure the best way to do that, but we do need to try. Now at this point, you might be wondering why I said we don't have to increase taxes, and then I immediately went into let's increase teacher salary. Those two things kind of don't go together. But as a matter of fact, they can if we just look at where the money is going in the education system and we reallocate it to things that are more important. So for example, let's consider school sports. I'm not going to advocate we should get rid of sports entirely. I wouldn't do that because a lot of people actually like them. Now I know that school sports are actually positive things as well. They can teach students about teamwork and camaraderie and leadership. All of these are positive attributes, which is why I'm not saying we get rid of them entirely. But we do need to recognize that we spend more on high school sports than we really should. It's consistently found, as this article points out, that in many cases, spending in athletics is nearly double that of per pupil spending in math, science, and English. And yes, I understand a lot of people like high school football or soccer or baseball or whatever the case may be, they like their high school sports. So we don't have to get rid of it. But maybe we should put a little bit more emphasis on them fundraising for themselves. Let's just recognize where our priorities are supposed to lie. If they're with high school sports, then fine, we can continue the way we have been. But if it's in education, and we want the education system to actually properly educate our students, we need to give them more money in education, not in sports. Another way we can actually cut down on the spending is looking at technology. Now,
that's an interesting idea. I know that band usually has to get funding for themselves, and that's why they have so many fundraisers for band. Marching band is what I'm thinking about here, and I believe it costs a decent amount of money to have a marching band because usually you're having to travel with the football team or soccer team or whatever it might be because that's where you play and perform and whatnot. And the amount of times they have to practice at the high school and flood the parking spots or the parking areas and whatnot. But I believe that most of the time marching bands do have to do quite a bit of fundraising to supply transportation cost and food cost and equipment cost or whatever it might necessarily be. And football and sports is a huge revenue for high schools, and also a huge amount of spending goes into it too. So the only way I would be able to confirm what he's saying here is to get the numbers of how much profit is made off of high school football, and seeing that would determine if that's a good idea to get rid of. But I don't necessarily think that that's the smartest idea either, because not everything should come to money. We should be mainly looking at to better the education system and not just try to come up with a basic idea. I don't think that money shouldn't be the main focus when we try to fix our schooling system. We should be trying to make a better system for everybody and not just focus on that one component.
Again, I'm not saying we should get rid of technology in schools necessarily, but you have to admit there's a good amount of money spent on unnecessary technology. It's not just me saying it, there are plenty of experts who agree.
We got ads now, so I love ads, but at least I'm quick on the mute button so we don't have to hear the generic ads over and over and over and over and over and over and over again. But it looks like we're about ready to go here.
With this. For example, this article from the Washington Post points out that we probably have too much technology in our schools, and they highlight two very important numbers. First, 1,000. That is the number of hours that the average student in the United States spends in a classroom. 1,000 hours a year, and we'll actually see that a little bit later as well. Second, 4,000. That's the number of hours that children spend on technology every single year, ages 8 through 18. And in case you don't think it's possible, that does account for multitasking. If you're on your phone scrolling through Facebook while watching TV, it counts both of those. So because students are spending so much more time on technology, the argument here goes that school should actually be a break from the norm in a sense. That because young people spend so much time with digital media outside of schools, schools must offer them a very different kind of education in order to even the cognitive scales. Now, the argument usually goes...
I don't know if I agree with that. Because there's a big push to try to make the classroom more digitally based and equipped to more technology, more equipment, so that students are able to learn faster and able to learn at something they might enjoy or have a better time at learning, and hopefully by having a better time be able to comprehend what they're talking about in a better way. So there's just a big general push to have more technology in the classroom. And since it's such a huge push when trying to make all these lesson plans for reading class or for I don't really see that as going away.
Those that students need to learn about technology because we live in a technological world, and I understand that. But consider the fact that a lot of students nowadays, elementary school even, have their own iPhones and iPads, and a lot of the time they know more about technology than the teachers do. So spending money on technology that is not necessary is not the best way to go. An example of this is the push to give every student a laptop, something that Peru did a few years ago, and it didn't really work for them. Even though it cost more than $200 million, they didn't really see any positive improvements. In the United States, we have spent over $60 billion by a conservative estimate to try and increase the use of computers in schools. This study about the one-to-one initiative saying that every student should have their own computer essentially argues that it's not beneficial. That instead of spending so much money on technology and teaching teachers how to actually use that technology, instead it should address teachers' beliefs about instruction itself. You should teach teachers to be better teachers, not teach them how to use technology. Again, I'm not against technology, it certainly has its place. But if we're spending billions of dollars on technology that is not needed, why are we doing that? That could instead go to teacher salaries or any number of places. Another change I think we should make, which would eventually save us money in the long run.
Not necessarily a bad idea by any means. I definitely see where he's coming from. And I think that a change of environment could potentially help the situation and resolve what's going on. I know like in Tombo ISD, there was a big push to get Chromebooks, the laptop, to all the students in the classroom who were in the dual program of, what is it? Not dual citizenship. What is it called? Dual credit classes to have a Chromebook and their computer technology. So I just think that there's a big push to equip technology in the classrooms to have easier learning environments. I see what he's saying for sure, and I think that some of his ideas have some credit to him, but I don't really think that that is going to be a potential fix that is realistic to actually work.
Long run, would be to cut down the number of hours students are actually in school. Now, we already saw, but I'm going to reiterate it right here, that in the United States, we spend about 1,000 hours in a classroom setting. And once again, we're really close to the top when you compare us to the other countries. The only countries that spend more time than us are countries like Chile, Mexico, and Costa Rica. And not to offend them or anything, but they're generally not the countries you want to be associated with when it comes to education. So we're spending more time in the classroom, spending more money at the same time, and we're not doing as well as many of these other countries. Very few studies are going to argue that spending more time in school or in the classroom is necessarily a good thing. It doesn't really work out that way. In many cases, spending more time in class does not benefit the students in any way. Now, one of the reasons this may be the case is because when they're in school, students are only on task for about 1/3 of the time they're actually there. Which means if you have a 6-hour-long school day, you're really only on task for 2 of those hours. As I already pointed out, you're not really going to find studies that link longer school days and improve test scores. Instead, what's important is not the quantity of hours, but the quality of interactions students have with teachers. So you can pile on
student to teacher ratio.
It doesn't necessarily mean school's going to be better, because what's actually important is how well the teacher teaches, as we've already seen multiple times. And many countries that have shorter school years and school days have higher test scores and grades. As we already saw, the United States is at the very top of the pack when it comes to hours spent in school. So I think we could lose a few hours. I'm not saying we cut it down dramatically, but we could cut it down by an hour or 2 every single day. And not only would it make the time students spend in school more effective, it would actually save money. So some of that money could be spent in teachers' salaries to get better teachers. Now, even though this is a political channel, up to this point I haven't really been too political, but that's going to change just a little bit right here. During the campaign, Kamala Harris had some ridiculous idea to increase the school day by 3 hours. Just let that sink in for 1 second. We already spend almost 1,000 hours in school in the United States. If we were to increase that by 3...
We don't have to get into the political angles because a lot of his news here is probably going to be older anyway, because he just brought up an example of Kamala Harris and the campaign. And let's break it or not, Kamala Harris is the vice president right now, so you're a little late there. But I did think that his information and what he said and some of his ideas were good as well. I don't know if it made sense there. I'm seeing if he has... Yeah, he does have his sources. Okay. I'm going to... Anyway, I'll have to make sure to go to his sources and pull up those graphs for my stream tomorrow, because we can probably use some of those for when we're talking about some of our issues for how to fix the education system with my co-host, Ann Votes. But that was all of his video here, what we were going to check out. We'll go now to our article by the Smithsonian. If we can wait for it to load up here. Come on. There he goes. Alrighty. Why are Finland schools successful? So this is getting into Finland and Korea, because those are the 2 schooling systems that are generally at the top of all of these schooling records through the OECD, if I'm remembering that right, the educational standards. And I've always, since like junior high, I've heard that Finland has a extremely good education program. And I just remembered something. Anyway, I'll make a note of that. One second here, guys. Alrighty. We can go back on track now. Why are Finland schools successful? Finland has vastly improved in reading, math, and science literacy over the past decade, in large part because its teachers are trusted to do whatever it takes to turn young lives around. This 13-year-old Bessert received something akin to royal tutoring. It took Bessert on that year as my private student, told him in his office, which boosted Bertol's Yellow Submarine poster on the wall and an electric guitar in a closet. When he was not studying science, geography, and math, he was parked next to the person's desk at the front of his house of a 9 and 10-year-olds, cracking open books from a tall stack, slowly reading one, then another, then devouring them by the dozens. By the end of the year, the son, Kosovo War refugees had acquired his adopted country vowel rich language and arrived at the realization that he could in fact learn. Whatever it takes is an attitude that drives the 30 teachers, but most of Finland's 62,000 educators and 3,500 schools from Lapland to Turkey, I think, professionals selected from the top 10% of the nation graduates earned their required master's degrees in education. Many schools are small enough so that the teachers know every student. If one method fails, teachers consult with their colleagues to try something else. They seem to relish the challenges. Nearly 30% of Finland's children receive some kind of special help during the first 9 years of school. A school where blank teachers served 240 first through 9th grades last year, and in contrast with Finland's reputation for ethnic homogeneity, more than half of its 150 elementary level students are immigrants from Somalia, Iraq, Russia, Bangladesh, Ethiopia, and among other nations. The transformation of the Finns education system began some 40 years ago as the key propellant of the country's economic recovery plan. Educators had little idea it would be so successful until 2000, when the first results from the Program for the International Student Assessment, PISA, a standardized test given to 15-year-olds in more than 40 global venues, revealed Finland's youth to be the best young readers in the world. 3 years later, they led in math. By 2006, Finland was first out of 57 countries and a few cities in science. In the 2009 PISA scores released last year, the nation came in second in science and third in reading and sixth in math among nearly 500,000 students worldwide. I am still surprised. A principal of the comprehensive school, I didn't realize we were that good. In the United States, which had muddied along in the middle of the past decade to introduce marketplace competition into public schools. In recent years, a group of Wall Street financiers and philanthropists such as Bill Gates have put money behind private sector ideas such as vouchers, data-driven curriculum, and charter schools, which had doubled in number in the past decade. President Obama, too, has apparently bet on competition. His race on the top initiative invites states to compete for federal dollars using tests and other methods to measure teachers, and a philosophy that would not fly in Finland. So, from what we're reading so far, it seems like the Finland's approach in a large part to education here is taking a very personalized route and focusing on their student-to-teacher ratio, having a very close relationship to what subject they're teaching and how they're teaching their subject, how they're going to better the situation for everybody. It goes on to talk a little bit more about this, but we don't necessarily have to read all of this Smithsonian article. We're going to go to our next one here. What Finland is doing really good to improve its acclimated schools. Finland has been paid outsized attention in the education awards, and students scored the highest among dozens of countries around the globe on an international test some 20 years ago. And while it is no longer number one as the educator sector, was hurt in the 2008 recession, and budget cuts led to larger class sizes and fewer staff in schools, it's still regarded as one of the more successful systems in the world. In an effort to improve, the Finnish government began taking some steps in recent years, and some of that reform has made for worldwide headlines, but as it turns out, some of that coverage just isn't true. A few years ago, for example, a change of curriculum sparked stories that Finland was giving up teaching traditional subjects. Nope. You can find stories on blah blah blah. Even aimed in its difficulties, American author William Doe, who lived there and sent his 7-year-old son to finish school, wrote in 2016, "They do a lot of things right." Here's a piece looking at changes underway in Finnish schools by two people who know what really is going on. Finland has been in the spotlight for the education award since it appeared against all odds on the top of rankings of an international test known as PISA or PISA. The program of international student assessment in the early 2000s. Tens of thousands of visitors have traveled the country to see how to improve their own schools. Hundreds of articles were written to explain why the Finnish educators is so marvelous or something that it isn't. Millions of tweets have been shared and read, often leading to debates about the real nature of Finland's schools and about teaching and learning there. We have learned a lot about why our educator systems perform better than others in terms of quality and equality of student outcomes. We also understand now better why some other education systems, for example England, Australia, United States, and Sweden, have not been able to improve their school systems regardless of politicians' promises, large-scale reforms, and truckloads of money spent on hazardous efforts to change schools during the past 2 decades. The teaching profession should be perceived as a technical temporary craft that anyone with a little guidance can do. Successful education systems rely on continuous professionalism of teaching and school leadership that requires advanced academic education. Besides, there are useful lessons about how and why educator systems work as they do. There are misunderstandings, incorrect interpretations, and even deliberate lies about how to best improve education systems. We're going to go down. So here are some common myths about the Finnish schools. We don't want that. Finally, because of the decentralized nature of authority in Finnish education system, schools in Finland can have a different profiles and practical arrangements, making the curriculum model unique in the world. It is incorrect to make general conclusions based off of what one or two schools do. Current school reform in Finland aims at the same overall goals that the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, which gives the PISA exam every 3 years to 15-year-olds in multiple countries, as well as governments and many students that are essential for them, to develop safe and collaborative school culture and to promote holistic approaches in teaching and learning. Understanding the relationship and interdependencies between different learning contents, be able to combine the knowledge and skills learned in different disciplines to meaningful wholes, and be able to apply knowledge and use it to collaborative setting. So those are some ideas as suggested by the Washington Post on Finland's education and why they are so good. Why does Finland have one of the best education systems? One, it doesn't like standardized testing. While students in the U.S. regularly take standardized tests to track their performance, Finnish students take just one during their entire time in primary and secondary schools, called the National Marta exam. The teacher's graded test measures yields much more than a score. It measures general academic maturity and is viewed as a sign of being a mature, educated person in Finnish society. Finnish lessons author, students are regularly asked to show their ability to cope with issues. It prioritizes play, While students in the U.S. may have hours of homework a night, Finnish students spend just a fraction of time on homework. Instead, the focus is placed on free time and play with students. Given frequent breaks during classroom instruction, considering research indicating the detrimental impacts of a deficit of play, this is anyway, 3. It is free for many students. It reserves its teachers, and it's a work in progress. While students are more undervalued in countries like the U.S., the opposite is true in Finland. Not only is the professionalism extremely selective, but teachers in Finland are treated better, work fewer hours, get paid more in many other countries. So I thought that was kind of interesting. This next one is about standardized testing. What was this video I had up? I think we'll keep going a little bit. So standardized testing is one of those concerns that I have really with how the United States education works, because I don't really think they do a very good job at determining the levels and what we can do here in the future to better our educational system, or to provide better outcomes, or in general to do anything to do anything that is generally received as a good thing. But we all know kind of the bad practicalities of standardized testing, so I don't think we really have to necessarily read that article. We can go back to it if we want. I think we're going to skip the journals I have for Finland's education system, because we're going to spend a little bit more time reading on Finland and Korea. I think we're going to go to... You know what? I think I'm going to call an end for this episode, because I think we're just going to keep these articles for the next one, and we'll start right away with this, and then we can get into videos that relate more to the topics at hand, and then we can get into how to fix the university system as well. So I think I'm going to go ahead and call it an end for today's stream. Thank you so much, Jimmy, for stopping by. Thank you, Great Equalizer. And thank you, Turret HA, for stopping by. I greatly appreciate everybody. And I hope everyone has a good day, good morning, or good night.